All right. Welcome back. For those of you who are just joining us for the afternoon, welcome to the session. And I'll get things started with our third panel today. I'm Kurt Teichert. I'm a teaching professor here in the Environmental Studies program, and I'm very pleased to be hosting this next panel. So we're covering equitable solutions to climate problems. And I really appreciate those of you who are in the room here and those of you who are joining us remotely. So we're going to have an initial round of the panelists sharing some of their work, some of the background behind their work and their work with their community partners. I'll have a few questions for them to guide that. And then in the second 40, 45 minutes or so of that, then we'll open it up to questions for folks in the room and for the folks that are joining us remotely as well. You'll have the opportunity to enter questions into the chat, and someone will be looking at that and translating that. Thank you very much. Okay. I do want to acknowledge we've got a number of community partners in the rooms, colleagues from the Woonasquatucket River Watershed Council, whom were acknowledged earlier. We have folks from the Emergency Management Agency, who at least were here earlier. And related to our panel today, or this afternoon, from Climate Jobs Rhode Island, we have Alex Kithis here, and Roots to Empower, Serena Russell. So we're... Hello, right? Okay, great. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Okay, all right. So, welcome. Thanks for staying above water. All right. Okay, so let's start out with just some brief introductions of your work. And Aparajita, I'll turn it to you to share the project that you're going to be working with us today on.
Thank you, Kurt, and thank you to the organizers of this conference. I'm very excited to share some of my work with all of you. So I work on the indigenous ecologies of the India-Bangladesh borderlands. Specifically, I study these very unique plant-human infrastructures called the Living Root Bridge that's put up here. These are plant-human infrastructures that the War-Khasi communities, who are a borderland community living in the India-Bangladesh zone, and how this community has historically woven the aerial roots of this plant, botanically called Ficus elastica, but locally known in this region as the Jiribamon. So Jiribamon in the War-Khasi language suggests this moody, willful tree that will only grow where it wishes. And these happen to be very steep and slippery terrains located at the edges of cliffs, waterfalls, and the War-Khasis have found a way to actually weave together the expansive aerial roots of the Jiribamon into this enduring infrastructure known in Khasi as the Jinking Jiri, translated in English as the Living Root Bridge. And these bridges have endured in these ecologies for more than 300 years. And they channel, apart from the relational environmental world, they are also very central to borderland economies because they offer historically marginalized communities channels of mobilities in this region. So a lot of these living root bridges are connected to border markets where things like vegetables like cabbages and pineapples that the War-Khasi hills are famous for actually go into the floodplains of Sylhet in Bangladesh. And then from Bangladesh, actually, fishes and rice that are cultivated in the floodplains of Sylhet enter the hills. And this kind of a socio-ecology and socio-economy has kind of predated nation states and empires in this region, and they have persisted. And one way in which I understand this persistence is called recalcitrance. So I study the recalcitrant plant-human worlds in these regions that speak about people and plant-based environmental sovereignties that have found a way to endure amidst deep political violence. So this is a borderlands. And this is a region that has historically faced massive violence in terms of colonial and post-colonial state building. In 19th century, this was a zone where the English East India Company started drawing some of the first boundaries between this region, right? And a lot of these colonial boundaries wanted to naturalize themselves. So they would often follow these kind of transitional zones that existed between the hills and the floodplains. So in that kind of colonial narrative, there would be this way of let's separate the hills from the plains. But in these kind of decolonial and pre-colonial ways of being, we see these relational ecologies and economies surviving and persisting. And so I study these living root bridges as belonging to that recalcitrant world. And there is definitely, there are questions of political conservation here that I'll get to in the next part. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparajita. All right, Brad, please share an intro to your work. It's on. It's being controlled remotely.
Great. So I'm a theoretical physicist here at Brown, and I'll be president of the American Physical Society starting January 1st, which is a 50,000 member organization representing physicists in the United States and the world. So my efforts with APS have been focused largely on climate change leadership, trying to involve more physicists in the climate problem, also energy, renewable energy. So contrary to something that was said by one of the panelists in the first session this morning, theoretical physics has a lot to do with the kinds of things that we're discussing today. There's so many examples, I couldn't go through them all, but I'm going to talk about one in particular. I've been working with two geochemists, Dan Ibarra here at Brown and Don Cardis at URI, to study something called enhanced rock weathering, which is an idea for removing carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere and trying to react it with rocks and transport ions, the carbonate ions, into the ocean eventually. That's the dream. And so it involves some very complicated geochemistry, involves soils, involves the water cycle, and a lot is not yet understood about it. And we have to be more certain that this approach can be a viable one. We need to learn how to measure the carbon dioxide removal and know that it can actually stay out of the atmosphere for, say, thousands of years. So geochemists have been working on this area for a while, but as part of the American Physical Society efforts on climate change, I was part of a report that we wrote to study the different types of carbon dioxide removal methods. And as a part of that research, I became aware of something that had been neglected in considering this enhanced rock weathering, which is that when we're putting large amounts of material down on large surface areas like agricultural land, that might change the amount of light that is absorbed or reflected by that surface. And a simple back-of-the-envelope calculation, like physicists like to do, shows that this effect can swamp the effect of the absorbed carbon dioxide. It can either go one way, it could darken the soil depending on the rock material, or it could lighten it with a different choice. So we've decided that we need to test this theory, and we're doing an experiment at the University of Rhode Island at their research station, their agricultural fields. And here you can see some limestone that we put down on an acre of soil a couple weeks ago, 3,000 pounds. It's a standard thing that farmers do to adjust the pH of the soil. And you can see just from looking at that picture in the upper right that the limestone's a little bit lighter than the soil. So when it goes down on the surface, it's going to reflect light a bit more than the surface that was untreated. And actually, it's quite a bit lighter than just that because it's bound together in this commercial product with a brown substance. And in those bottles in the lower left, you can see in the far left, that's just a water bottle that had been filled with some carbon dioxide and a little bit of that limestone, and it's become pinched because it's been absorbing the carbon dioxide. It's also turned brownish just because of this binding material. So my role as a physicist is I've been measuring as precisely as I can the reflection of light from the surface. And in the lower right is a photo of our albedometer, which I'm learning how to make as precise measurements as possible, looking at the treated surface and comparing it to the untreated surface, seeing how the albedo of the land has changed. So looking forward to talking about that some more.
Thanks very much, Brad. All right. And now Tom will seamlessly draw these two research programs together in what he does.
Kurt, thank you, Kurt. Kurt was making a joke before, excuse me, about how disparate our panel was. Well, you can judge. So my research, actually, rather than go looking for a community partner, my research started when a community partner came looking for me. A group called Climate Jobs Rhode Island. Serena is in the back from, she's here as their representative. They came to me and said, look, we've been talking at the, Climate Jobs is a coalition of a bunch of, most of the state's unions and a bunch of environmental groups in the state. And they had been participating in the Public Utilities Commission Future of Gas docket. And they said, we are dissatisfied with the quality of the implementation plans and projections that we're seeing there. And they asked me specifically, could you help us come up with a sensible implementation plan that is not done at the level of gross aggregates, but that actually looks at the lives of people? And what we would very much like is for you to help us put a price on fairness. Like, okay, so we're gonna have a transition, hopefully. What would it cost us to do it? What would be a reasonable way to do that? And how much extra, if any, would it actually cost us to be fair about it? And that, of course, starts off the whole question of, well, fairness. People have been arguing about fairness for, what, 5,000 or 6,000 years. So what would you actually expect to do there? And we came up with the idea of asking people what they thought. I know this is like advanced science, right? This is really important work, and so that's what we are trying to do. So the project involves both trying to come up with an implementation plan, but also to sort of set the bounds, set the boundary conditions of the implementation plan early on by talking to people whose jobs are potentially at risk. And then what happened was that the ECF program appeared, and with help from that program, we were able to expand the scope of it. Originally, they had Climate Jobs had just been asking us about the few hundred people who are involved in the oil and gas industry in Rhode Island, which, we're not Texas, right? It's not that many people. But with the help of the ECF funds, we've expanded the scope to include sort of buildings more generally. So not just the people who work at delivering oil and gas to buildings, but also the people who own them and build them, and the people who live in them and own them. And so we've been conducting interviews through the summer and the fall. We're looking forward to doing some focus groups with people. We have a focus group scheduled for Monday, and I'm looking at Charlotte, a student assistant in the back there, who is acknowledging to me that we actually do have enough people for the focus group. The focus group is going to be assisted. The running of the focus groups is being done by another community partner called Roots to Empower, and Alex Kithis is here from them. Alex is also a housing organizer based in Woonsocket, and so with them, the Monday session is going to be mostly tenants. and people talking about what are the issues of fairness that they see in their relationship with the landlords, and how we can imagine that changing as we try to electrify their buildings and things like that. I think that's enough introduction for the moment. Except I should also mention that the photo there is from my other student assistant who was ill today. So she declined to infect us, which I think is laudable. Yes, community sensitive. Anyway, thank you.
All right, thanks, Tom. Okay, Chris, please share a little bit of the background of the work you're sharing with us today.
Sure. And let me start by saying what others have already said, which is thank you to the organizers, Beth in particular, for the invitation to come and to participate. And I was not here for the morning, but when I walked into the room, the energy was wonderful and palpable, and that's really great to feel. So honored to be here. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some work that the ongoing work that I'm doing that's on environmental enforcement. I'm a sociologist and a scholar of environmental politics and policy, based partly in the Watson School. And you may or may not know that that in the United States we rely, well, I'm sure you know that in the United States we rely a lot on litigation to get things done. Newsflash. So lawsuits are a big part of politics here. And what you might not know is that in the 70s, when a lot of the major environmental statutes were penned or reformed substantially, they included what are called citizen suit provisions in them, which empower citizen groups in principle to bring suits on behalf of the public interest on some level, at least in theory, where they allege or are concerned about environmental harms, i.e. the government not doing its job in enforcing the law. And this is actually, was probably remarkably prescient, right? At least we could think of it in that way, right? So like in a moment, like the political moment we find ourselves in now, when the federal government is stepping away from the enforcement of environmental law, it becomes incredibly important that we have other mechanisms to hold government accountable to its obligations. Now, there are a lot of problems with environmental law. One of them, in terms of climate, is that we don't have a statute about climate. So we have to bring lawsuits under other statutes for other reasons and so on. That's one issue, which is to say more broadly that the law itself structures what we can actually get done, right? But there's another question also, which is that when you leave enforcement to citizen groups, right? When you sort of outsource or privatize, if you want to call it that, enforcement of environmental law, what happens, right? What gets focused on? And there are various ways of sort of trying to understand what patterns emerge when you look at patterns of litigation overall. But what I've done over the last few years is gathered up a lot of data on federal lawsuits on this, and tried to understand what is being focused on by groups who bring such suits and what is not being focused on. And therefore, sort of what areas of law we can count on being more robustly enforced with some help from civil society, and what areas might be overlooked. And what you see in the chart there's sort of two graphs. These are patterns of the content, the textual content of legal decisions brought forward by either environmental groups on the left there or by the federal government on the right. The federal government, of course, also does a lot of enforcement, right? And the top very dark color there, sort of administrative law type topics like discussion of sort of the esoteric elements of law itself. We don't need to pay a ton of attention to that. But on the bottom half of the left chart, you'll see that big sort of grayish, greenish swath. Those are decisions that are focused on land use and conservation, right? Driven by environmental advocacy groups. That is where the lion's share of that advocacy is focused. And if you look at this geographically, you'll also see that almost all of those lawsuits are focused west of the Rockies. Most of us live east of the Rockies. That's also where a great deal of pollution and environmental inequality is focused, the Midwest, the South, et cetera. But that's not where legal attention is paid. The federal government has a different profile of attention that I'm not going to call a lot of attention to. But the point here is just to start to think about where we're looking and where we're not in a legal regime where citizen groups are driving the enforcement process. So I think that's enough introduction for me, and I look forward to more discussion.
Great, thanks very much. So how's that for a range of topics? All right. All right, so now I just want to go back a little bit and just get a little bit more of your background. So Aparajita, what brought you to this interesting study of this indigenous conservation culture in the borderlands?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, part of the story is definitely personal because I grew up in Assam, which is located in the floodplains of the Eastern Himalayas. So growing up, I kind of saw some of these environmental transitional zones. There's a kind of firsthand experience with floods and how floods can be of different types, some which are catastrophic and some which are actually very life-giving, right? The catastrophic floods are often connected with questions of unregulated development, mining and extraction that happens in the upstream areas of the Himalayas, and how that kind of extractive activity that has continued from the colonial to the post-colonial time has an effect in floodplain regions, right? So that's the personal story, and that's one of the reasons why I decided to ultimately become an environmental historian. One of the questions that has led me to this project around the living root bridges is to really understand how might we think about histories of environmental stewardship amongst people who are also the frontline communities enduring climate change. So the Khasi Hills of Meghalaya, located very close to the Bangladesh borderlands, are the rainiest place on earth. So when the monsoons come, I think one requires a real ability to read rains. And there are these kind of indigenous historical coping cultures of reading rains, of engaging with the plant worlds. The jiribamon is the plant, the moody plant, which is also a water-loving plant. So there's a real recognition amongst the War Khasis about the agenting, about plants possessing agency, and how these are very important and enduring building blocks of societies, right? So academically, I think the project made me think about plant worlds and indigenous life worlds, and how might we think about questions of environmental design and climate design that goes beyond technocratic understandings. How might we think about questions of conservation that are not state-centric, that doesn't exclude some of these frontline communities from the table, from the decision-making table. Historically, that has required me to think about different kinds of archives. It has made me think about different ways of conducting research. So a large part of my project engages with participatory research. I work with community partners, specifically the Living Bridge Foundation, which is a grassroots conservation society located in Peninsula. This is a border town in the East Khasi Hills. It has approximately 20 generational living root bridges that connect this region to the borderlands of Bangladesh, and how this grassroots conservation society is kind of engaging with some of the very state-led technocratic understandings of conservation. And there's over the years I've traced some of that work, and I've thought about ways in which we may think about alliance building between academic work and the important work that happens on the ground in ways that would actually be meaningful to the communities we study. So what are the kind of commitments we have as scholars, right? Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. Brad, can you share a little bit more about just the wellspring of this research approach you're taking? Because you're combining two modes of research that have traditionally been separate. So what's some of the background behind that?
Yeah, I guess a thrust of my work here at Brown has been overcoming disciplinary barriers, siloing in fields. And So I've been struck, even within physics, that there's a lot of separateness between different areas, and ideas that were discovered in one field can benefit another but haven't been transmitted. So about 10 years ago, I and two French collaborators realized that William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, discovered a type of wave called a coastal Kelvin wave, which has an origin in the mathematics of topology that had only been rediscovered by quantum physicists about 20 years ago. And so, physicists don't usually go to geophysics seminars and vice versa. So there are these potential connections that can be made, and that really drove home for me the importance of paying attention to those kinds of possibilities. So when I was studying this problem of enhanced rock weathering, then I was kind of looking around thinking, different perspectives that we could take on this rock weathering. And that's where the radiative transfer idea that I've been familiar with from climate physics came together with the geochemistry that somebody like Dan Ibarra is a real expert in rock weathering, to see how these two might fuse together. And maybe, you can have a situation, the dream is, well, farmers have the co-benefit of having improved crops through the addition of important minerals to their soil. Then you will have carbon dioxide removal from enhanced rock weathering, if that works. And then finally, you could have some immediate benefit from cooling due to increasing the surface brightness. So that would be like the best of all worlds if we could achieve all of those things. That seems like something worthy to try to do.
Thanks. Tom, you mentioned the community partners found you and worked with this, but were you doing work in the energy transition, or what led to that connection?
So, my work on climate stuff, on climate issues, I think actually dates back to the first job that I had out of college was at Woods Hole at the Oceanographic Institute, where I was just a research assistant working for a bunch of guys with money from Shell and Mobil, I should say, that bought a year of my time and a 1 gigabyte disk, so that sort of can date it for you. It was a little worrisome because not only was it as big as a refrigerator, but everybody worried that the disk didn't come out. So it's something that has become a little hard to explain. But anybody who's old enough might remember. Anyway, my life went in a different direction from there, and I wound up working in computer science and data science for years. But then what happened was I started doing public policy chores for local nonprofits. I was living here, and I started doing work for people. And after a little while, people started bringing me the nerdiest public policy issues. So I wound up working on public finance, on environmental, reading environmental impact statements, testing, high-stakes testing, which required statistical analyses that I don't want to actually blame people, but I couldn't get any Brown statisticians to help me with this, so I wound up doing that, by the way. But over time, I came to be doing this kind of work with people, and so when Climate Jobs had a need for that, they thought of me, and I think that it's good to get involved in the community for a project, but it's even better to get involved in the community as a as a career, as a calling. It's part of part of helping out the place that you're in. Anyway, that's how they wound up coming to me as somebody they trusted to look at data and to be rigorous about the findings that you see in the data, and to help them piece together what they hope will be a technically persuasive set of policies and goals. So that's not much more to say than that.
Great, thanks. All right, Chris, you've pointed out these disparities in the environmental regulation and litigation. What brought you to that? And was it geographic, or how did you come to identify that particular issue that you're focusing on?
Yeah. Well, as you may have intuited in my little spiel a minute ago, this particular piece of research is not community partnered, but it actually started with partnerships. And I was working actually very closely with the Army Corps of Engineers doing some separate work. And I was shocked by how often people's stories of being deposed for lawsuits came up. Right? How many regulators? I was working with the regulatory division on with Clean Water permitting, Clean Water Act, Section 404 permitting. Anyway, how many of them had been in a courtroom or in a room with lawyers to be deposed for a lawsuit? Which was striking to me. I thought, well, I don't think that we meaning sociologists and scholars of environmental policy, know a tremendous amount about what's going on in that legal space. So let me start looking. And then I have to confess, I'm not a social media type person, but I did actually see a post on Twitter that really caught my eye that I'll share with you. It was a person who worked for the Center for Biological Diversity, which is a very active conservation organization, particularly in the West. Many of you probably know the group. And this person posted something that said, I'm paraphrasing here, but it was like, that feeling when you call the BLM to let them know that you're suing them, and then they say, "Oh yeah, I'm a member." And I sort of thought, okay, there's something going on here. Like, these folks are, in a court of law on opposite sides of an issue, but are actually like on the same team. And to me, that's interesting in its own right. It also signaled an affinity between what the groups are doing and what the agencies are doing and where legal attention is being focused. And so that was the starting point for me, starting to try to figure out more systematically, really just mapping the patterns that I would over time nationally in the United States to try to figure out what's going on. And when I did that, I realized, holy smokes, there's really serious inequities that are emerging out of this particular approach to enforcing environmental law.
Thank you. All right, thanks. Next, we're going to move into just getting a little bit better sense of just how interdisciplinarity and/or community engagement are a key part of your work. So, Aparajita, I'm particularly interested as someone who could easily identify as a technocrat of European descent, how these indigenous voices and this community knowledge, what are the opportunities to really bring that up? And influence the way that things are being decided at a much higher technical level.
Thank you, Kurt. I think that's a really important question. I think, firstly, it points us towards the political economy of expertise, right? The members of the Living Bridge Foundation, and here I want to point towards the important work that Morningstar Kangtao has done, who is a Warkasi Living Root Bridge builder, and how there is a debate that this organization has started about wanting to recognize the people who have woven these bridges as architects of their own right, and not simply artisans, right? And recognizing indigenous people who have woven these enduring infrastructures as an architect is a claim to the political economy. And it's also a kind of borderland civil society that is trying to engage with the UNESCO discourse. And the UNESCO discourse is not something I got a chance to speak about, but in March 2022, the Indian government has nominated the Living Root Bridges as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So currently it's in the process of being nominated. So this has actually started a political debate within borderland society, within borderland civil societies, where there is a question about who gets to who gets to manage and who gets to kind of shape this narrative, right? And interestingly, those of us who've got the chance to study UNESCO or how it works, that this is a intergovernmental treaty organization, which means that these kind of international organizations always go through very state-led channels. So it can be very difficult for a grassroots community to kind of, it'll be recognized, but to what extent are there questions of participatory, equitable participatory in that kind of management scheme? So part of my work has been about advocacy, for sure. And it's been also about understanding histories of conservation, these kind of state-led conservation, and how thinking about them historically might help us understand, go beyond these kind of Eurocentric technocratic knowledge. And I say Eurocentric partly because of the histories that are attached to this tree and these people. Botanically, the Jiribamon is called Ficus elastica. So this is a rubber tree that was identified by the colonial botanists in British India, mainly because of its rubber secreting capacities. Now, over 50 years in 19th century, British colonial botanists tried to mold, trim, and graft this tree into a successful rubber secreting commodity crop. They failed, right? Now, this is, so the story of failure is really important because it interrupts the Eurocentric triumphant narrative of knowledge. And what we see is that this kind of expansive material growth pattern of the Jiribamon that is moody and willful remained unknowable to colonial botanists. But the same materiality was something that was legible to the indigenous Khasi plant experts, who saw the tree and kind of appreciated it and engaged with it in a very different capacity, right? In the histories of the Jinking Jiri, the living root bridge, the Jiribamon is recognized as a co-builder because this is a tree, a co-builder that would continue the bridge building process beyond a single human lifetime. So there are intergenerational stories connected to it, and there are these kind of relational worlds. So, and I think I just want to conclude that sometimes a very technocratic understanding of these bridges may make them into a spectacle, right? Because these are beautiful infrastructures, there's no denying that. But what is even more incredible are these relational histories, are the people who have kind of endured and who have sustained these worlds, right?
Thank you. Brad, in the research, which you acknowledge and I acknowledge, is in its very early stages, but I find it particularly interesting that that you're working with URI and with the cooperative extension functions there and everything else. I mean, what are the opportunities if this bears out to work with that relationship and really help that in some of the translation of this research?
Right. Thanks for that question. So. We are, right now, our research is just funded with some internal funding from the physics department here, but we'll likely apply for some funding, external funding from the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education group that funds research in the Northeast. And that could move into a relationship with commercial farmers. That's important because any of these ideas to try to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere have to scale to an enormous size. So in the case of enhanced rock weathering, we're talking about a substantial fraction of Earth's agriculture would have to be on board with doing these kinds of things. And so that means talking to farmers across cultures and in all sorts of different environments. So learning how to do that will be an important step for us as we move, if things are promising and we keep on moving. Now, Earth's soils contain about 5 times, I think, as much carbon in them than the atmosphere does. And a lot of our soils have been eroded due to poor agricultural practices. So there's the possibility of trying to heal the soils with practices such as no-till agriculture, things that like the Land Institute out in Kansas has been pioneering with perennial grasses. So that might meld nicely with this idea of leaving crushed rock on the surface where the minerals will slowly go into the soil instead of tilling it in and increasing soil erosion. So it's these kinds of considerations that perhaps will be attractive to farmers around the world. And we've just begun to think about these things.
Thank you. And I think I just want to acknowledge Betsy Laux had made the point earlier about just the use of the word climate change. I'm guessing as we want to scale this to the farming community across the nation, we wouldn't necessarily frame it in climate terms, right? It would be about productivity.
Yes.
Yep. All right. Tom, can you speak a little bit more about the collaboration with your community partners here and some of the ways maybe the ECF funding has helped to enhance more the interdisciplinary of the work, or if at all?
Well, the ECF, excuse me, as I said, the ECF funding was really vital to turn this from a very narrow look at a few hundred jobs into a much broader look at a whole sector of the economy. Something like 30 or 40% of the carbon that Rhode Island emits comes from buildings. So that's a place where you can actually where we need to go. But trying to understand how to do that in a thoughtful way, and again in a way that doesn't wind up putting the costs where they are least able to be borne. That's an important step of it. The community partners, and I actually omitted one too. There's a group called Build RI that is a coalition of both labor unions and builders. You know, the companies that do the building, is also a useful community partner. They have been really vital in, I mean, since the project involves reaching out to the community and learning from the people who we're talking about, the community partners have been really vital in making those connections to get there. The Roots to Empower folks are going to be running the focus groups. That's something they have some experience doing. But they've also been vital in helping us reach out to tenants and owners and landlords as well to find the people to talk to. Which turns out to be a lot harder than it sounds. We have come up with lots of different ways to bribe people, little gift cards that are an important part of it. The climate jobs, people have also been totally invaluable in reaching out to unions to talk to people about their jobs. We've learned all kinds of things about the details of the the details of the unions that we're talking to, how the different ways that they finance job training, the different ways they think about job training. Those have all been really important to us and are going to continue to be important as we try to put these findings into policy proposals. It does turn out to be, like I said, a lot harder than we had anticipated to talk to people about their jobs or about their housing. People are a little guarded, and so without the partners, I think we'd be pretty much nowhere. With them, it's still hard, but we're making, we're getting there. We're making progress, and we are able with their help to get perspective on the different, one of the things that I have learned over years of doing public policy work is how totally different two things that are exactly the same can be, right? You have a school over here and a school over here, but this one is funded in a totally different way from that one. And it turns out the same thing is true of unions. You have a plumbers union here and a plumbers union here. These guys finance all their own training and are in many ways sort of future-proofed by their attitude toward training. And these guys fund none of it at all and are totally dependent on the employer to do the to think about those things for them. And that's a difference that we did not really think about until diving in to look at the details. And I think the details are where useful solutions are going to emerge, and so we're happy to be there. But we wouldn't be there without the community partners there to sort of guide me.
Thank you. Chris, I want to refer to a question and discussion we had in an earlier panel about particularly early career researchers and some of the challenges to do interdisciplinary work, and particularly some of the work that you're doing where you're also trying to understand the work of advocacy organizations and how that works in. Can you talk a little bit more about your experience with some of the challenges and opportunities of interdisciplinarity, particularly in the earlier phases of academic work?
Sure. And I think I claim no monopoly on knowledge about that question. So I'm sure that I look forward to a broader conversation with the audience about that. So I guess I would say two things. I mean, the first is that our panel is sort of absurdly diverse. But you can see how rich interdisciplinary work is or could be given the topics that we're dealing with, right? So that, for example, we can imagine, and it's easy for me to imagine this as a starting place as a sociologist, that sort of like ideas, and I think that actually my colleague Rachel Wetz is going to talk about this a little bit later, but how we sort of think about nature or the environment shapes political action in relation to it, right? But also that the material qualities of those things matter for how those understandings develop, which it has, of course, linkages to the natural sciences, and so on and so forth. So we can imagine how bringing all of these different dimensions of knowledge together is important. This is like the IBIS shtick, right? But the disciplinary structure that we in the academy are embedded within does not reflect that. And so I would say that as a sociologist, I'm explicitly discouraged from that kind of work as a pre-tenure scholar, because I need to sort of prove my mettle as a sociologist, right? Not as an interdisciplinary environmental social scientist, which is really how I think of myself in a deeper sense. So I'm not sure exactly how to push past those obstacles. I think that they're serious ones and big ones, but they are worth thinking about, and I'm sure many other people in the room have ideas about how to push past them. But I will just say that I think that for those of us who are housed in sort of traditional disciplines, we have work to do in those spaces. It's not just about moving to other interdisciplinary spaces and creating cultures and communities in those places, which is great, but we have to also reform how we think about these things in our own sort of homes, if you want, right? So I have work to do in sociology. There may be work to be done in history and physics and so on, to convince other people that we need to think differently about that in those spaces, so that change is sort of coming from, if you want, the bottom up as well as from the outside or the top down. So that's a starting place. I'll also just quickly add one other tidbit, which is it's sort of orthogonal to what I'm just talking about. Not so much about the challenges of interdisciplinary work, but about doing work that raises questions that are tough for the people that you're working with. So in my case, some of my findings are a little bit uncomfortable for environmental advocates who think of themselves as champions of justice and equity and climate, right? But whose sort of aggregate actions, at least, may not reflect some of those values. And that is awkward, right? And it's a challenge I think that we have to take seriously. Partnerships are wonderful and great, but can knowledge or empirical facts that we discover in those partnerships can be difficult, I guess I would say, and require negotiation and thinking through. And so I would also love to extend the conversation about navigating those kinds of tensions and challenges as well.
All right, thanks very much. So now let's see what you all have in terms of questions for our panel. Let me just check in. Do we have some questions that have come in from folks online? All right. Yeah.
We have one question from James Lenza. This is directed to Tom, but others can comment. Tom, any connections to the Climate Action Strategy Executive Summary for Rhode Island that was released last week?
Oh, no connections we did not participate in putting it together, but it is part of our the charge I was given by the climate jobs guys not to duplicate work that is already being done. So I'm reading it too, I guess is. I mean, the state is doing quite a bit of its own work. We sat down a couple of weeks ago. I guess Charlotte had to go. We sat down a couple of weeks ago with the state's Office of Energy Resources to make to see what kinds of survey work they had already done that might be relevant to what we're working on. It is our interest in making a better implementation plan than the ones that we've seen out there, but it is our interest, also in our interest, to take advantage of the work that is already being done, not to ignore it. And that work has been going on for quite a while. One of the problems that we see with out there, though, is that a great deal of work is about planning sort of at the aggregate level, like where it's talking about, oh, there's 39 towns, or there's 8,000 people in this category, or 5 towns in this category, that category. And those are important plans to make, but they are not actually the same as plans of action. Those tend to be estimates of what a cost might be, but they're not necessarily actionable plans. So in some cases where it seems as if we might be operating in the same ground, we're trying to do it at a somewhat more granular level.
All right, questions here?
Hello, my name is Fanny. I'm an undergrad student in IBIS. Thank you so much for the panel. It was lovely to hear from all of your perspectives. And yeah, I mean, ridiculously divergent in terms of fields, but I think that also really is very IBIS in many ways. And my question actually kind of relates to that. So as a student who's taking classes both in like hardcore humanities and hardcore STEM fields, and who sees, I mean, representation for both on this panel, I feel like when I've been talking to my classmates, we've been feeling a real urge to connect those two fields, and a real frustration at how we are learning about one thing in one course, and then in the next course, like for example, we're learning about decolonial futures, and then the next course we're taking a STEM class that like seems to be like doing exactly the extractive practices that we just learned that we shouldn't do anymore. But I've also just struggled finding classes where professors join forces in a way that feels like it actually like both enables continuation of STEM research, which is absolutely necessary for climate futures, and also brings that like actual like reciprocal approach and decolonial approach to that kind of knowledge production. So I guess I'm wondering how you all see your role in that process, if you have thought about it at all, or if you feel like you have a responsibility towards that. And yeah, just intrigued as to like how you think collaborating with very different like professors and researchers can look like. And of course, it might be awkward, as Professor Ray pointed out earlier. But yeah, just wondering your thoughts.
I can
Thanks.
take this. Thank you so much. I think you raised a really important question. I think like addressing problems of climate change or trying to think about solutions really require that kind of interdisciplinary bridge between the humanities and the natural sciences. In my own work, so I work on the histories of plant-human relations. A lot of that work has actually been informed by the works of botanists. And here, even though I'm critical of colonial botanists, botany as a contemporary discipline today, I think just some of the critical insights that have come from botanists like Robin Wall Kimmerer, right? Canadian ecologist Susan Simard. A lot of these writers are kind of centering a revisionist understanding of plant worlds, right? Plant worlds that do not subscribe to that colonial capitalist worldview where plants were understood as, oh, plants colonize, just like humans. And then so ecologist Susan Simard actually said, no, actually they don't. This is a very complex world. There are actually interrelational socialities that exist amongst plant worlds too, and there are these kind of species that foster, right? She talks about these kind of massive trees that exist in the forest with wide underground root system, with mycorrhizal fungi that contributes to forest health. And just reading some of that work was very, very helpful for me because I could see the Jiribamon also being a similar kind of an entity in the forest, right? And the indigenous life worlds recognize that. So I'm very much about inviting those collaborations, like humanities and critical social science thinkers kind of working together. Because there's been a lot of that work from the scientific disciplines. I mean, I can go on and on. There's Banu Subramaniam, who's also from a very science background, botanical background, but is bringing humanities and the sciences together. So thank you for that question. I think we need more of that collaboration. We need more of that interdisciplinary thinking in our work.
Okay, maybe I'll add a few words from my perspective. So, I'm sort of am narrowly focused on some scientific question, but I see it as sort of an onion, and going out from just using this example of the rock weathering. First, there's economics of the thing, whether it makes economic sense. But then there's a whole moral dimension. So there's this moral hazard question. If we engage in trying to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, will some powerful entities use that as an excuse to continue polluting? So there we get into some deep philosophical questions. And then even beyond that, there's this, it's kind of an illusion, I think, that there's going to be a pure technical solution or even a multiplicity of technical solutions to the climate change problem. We're really talking about fundamental human nature. Why do we grasp so much? Why do we want so much? These kinds of broader issues. So, I think students are able to traverse these different layers of the onion much more readily than a 3-year-old person can, just as a generality. And so that's a real advantage for, in your education, just taking a fresh look at all of these things.
I'd love to add a little thing too. Just the one of the pleasures of being at Brown at a room like this is that I get to lose for a moment the feeling that sometimes I have that I am going to be the last math and science guy on the deck of a sinking ship waving the flag of humanities, waving the flag of a liberal education. The thing is that you never actually know what preparation you have is going to be useful. And the things that I learned from Dickens helped me understand economics in a way that gave me a much deeper appreciation for what I was reading. Insights from reading O. Henry to my children taught me about housing in a way that I had never really thought about. The connections that you're going to make in the future, you have no idea right now. The time for you now, and this is, the task for your time now is to cast as wide a net as you can so that you'll have these things in your quiver when you're faced with problems, when you're faced with difficult questions to ask. Philosophy classes that I took years ago allowed me to laugh off when somebody told me there was only one definition of ethical. Those are things that you'll have in your arsenal for the future. And so sample as widely as you can and it'll be useful someday.
All right, thank you. Other questions?
I think we've lost internet connection in this room in some places. So yeah, I did have, there was a question on Zoom, and I'm not sure if we're still connected to Zoom. So if Zoom people are listening, Brown IT is trying to work that out across campus. We're sorry, but I will keep on going.
Well, for those of us in the room, thank you for this amazing interdisciplinary panel. My question is related to each of your experiences as scholars in disciplines that may not on first blush be ones that people would assume are addressing the topics that you are in an intersectional way. I'm curious what advice you have for other scholars that are working across disciplines about how you socialize this work in your kind of home discipline, how you build communities, and how you even think about publishing in traditional journals that may not fully understand this work in the lenses through which work in that discipline may traditionally be published.
I'm happy to start a response. So one thought that comes to mind, this is on, I can't tell if, yeah, okay. So one thought that comes to mind is actually a little bit contradictory to what I said a moment ago. But I think it's important to appreciate that tension and complexity. So speaking as a sociologist working in that, trained in that discipline, trying to get tenure in that discipline, right? I think it's actually really important to show other scholars in that field how important and how much we can learn, like about, for example, the things that sociologists care about vis-a-vis the study of environment. And like that implies likewise that we can learn a lot about how to address, for example, the problems of climate change through the sociological lens. And I think there's probably a similar lesson in physics and in history and in any other discipline that has sort of like a conventional core that isn't inherently interdisciplinary to begin with. So that is to say that I think that there's one way to do what you're talking about is actually to make these topics legible to the places that already exist and learn from them in that way, as the way a sociologist would say, as a case of something. But that, I think, is only one half of the puzzle, and the other half is truly interdisciplinarity, true interdisciplinarity. And I think that that's just a lot harder. So like, I have published a couple of papers in well-respected interdisciplinary environmental journals, like Nature franchise type journals, and frankly, sociologists don't really care, right? And so like that, I don't know, I don't have a simple answer to solving that problem, but it means that we have work to do. So I don't know if other panelists have thoughts.
I mean, for sure, I mean, doing interdisciplinary work is always a challenge, especially when we are trying to get our works published in a particular journal, or even thinking about our own fields and how to contribute to it. But one way in which I've thought about it is, how do I kind of communicate some of the work that I'm doing in a language that that moves beyond some of the jargons, in my case, some of the historical jargons. In what ways would it be useful for other kinds of scholars who have shared intellectual interests? For history, I can say that we are in this very interesting juncture where there is a kind of recognition for multi-species histories, and so I do not feel siloed at all. So it's an interesting time, and I think it also requires us, when we are workshopping some of our works, and there might be a certain kind of criticism sometimes, right? And to not feel wary of it. And this is like my advice to more like junior scholars in these kind of very formative years, how to deal with academic criticism in these very early stages. I think like one of my takeaways is to really think about persuasive writing. Like, how do I, to not kind of lose ground, but think about the ways is what are these critiques kind of trying to say? Do I want to represent them? Do I want to address them more directly? So it's a dialogue. I think it requires a kind of work both within our discipline and also beyond it, right?
So physicists have a reputation for being parochial sometimes, and I think it's partly deserved. And often I meet, very, really well-respected physicists who are drilling down on one problem their whole career, making progress, and I'm just sort of in awe of that. I've never had that kind of discipline. But then I tell myself, I just remind myself that this is our work that we're doing. This is the work that needs to be done at this time, working on climate change. It's so important, and I'm sometimes wistful. I'm not just working on high temperature superconductivity, which is what my PhD was on, but on the other hand, this kind of work has really put me in contact with a large number of colleagues in different fields, and that I just feel that it's something that the young physicists are really responding to, and there's a kind of change in the attitude that's happening in the field.
I just want to take this opportunity to acknowledge Harold Ward as the founder not only of environmental studies at Brown, but really of the way environmental studies is taught in many schools. He was a chemistry scholar, got tenure. He had members of the community coming to him to try to understand how the new Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act regulations, something called environmental impact statements for help with how to interpret those, and actually went back to school, got a JD, but his approach was to sit with his students and learn the disciplines that were required to answer some of these very challenging questions that came in. So Harold's early work and how that's manifest in this excellent conversation today, I just wanted to take the opportunity to acknowledge that. Beth?
Thanks, Kurt. Yeah, I'm going to do a little bit of editorializing myself. One is that I do want to say, I know that you guys would not normally come into conversations with each other just because of how diverse this panel is, which is one of the reasons why the organizers wanted to put this panel together. And so I want to just draw out what some of the threads are that I think are really valuable here. One is that, all of you are thinking about solutions. You're all thinking about solutions to climate change and the problems that they present for society. And what I love is that each of you in your own way is grappling with how to make those solutions fair and durable, and that those are the kinds of questions that Equitable Climate Futures have at its core. That's what we're really interested in promoting, robust thinking about how to get to solutions more quickly and to make sure that they're acceptable to the communities who are going to be most impacted by them. And that's why community engagement is so important and why interdisciplinarity is important, because of all of the different perspectives that we get as we're thinking about the solutions. So I want to call out that we do have an opportunity to form more working groups. Two of the panelists are leaders of working groups, ECF working groups. So, I just really want to underscore that these are great examples. The conversation you're hearing is a great example of the kind of thinking that we're interested in supporting. Okay, so that was my editorializing / advertisement for ECF working groups. But here is, I'd like to turn this question back to the panel, which is, when you all are thinking about the kinds of solutions that your research is looking at, I know, Tom, you've brought up the question of fairness. It was really the motivation. And so I'd like you to all to comment on how you are addressing that issue of fairness and also durability. Like, how do the solutions that you think you might be driving toward become sustainable?
I can start, and I should, as I start, I should, we are starting with this inquiry into fairness with our community partners to try to set some essentially sort of constraints on the policies that we develop. Right. That's like. Developing public policy is sort of like any other engineering problem. There's a solution that you're after, but there's constraints, right? Nobody ever says, make this thing. They always say, make this thing or build this building within this cost, or using these materials, right? There's always a constraint to the problem. And so in essence, what we're doing is we're coming up with the constraints to the problem through our work with the community partners. However, the secret agenda is that the outreach through those community partners is also going to be useful to us to sort of build consensus around the solutions that we come up with. So the intention here is not only to go out and ask them their opinions at the first step, but the intention is to remember those phone numbers and email addresses and towns and organizations that we've spoken to, and go back to them later in the spring or next summer to say, what do you think? And to because I think that without building consensus around the solutions that we come up with, they risk being sort of evanescent things. Something, a report to put on a shelf, or a good idea that somebody had back in 2025. That those are I think the ways that we hope to turn this into a more permanent kind of a set of solutions. So
when we were first designing our experiment at URI, we were going to put a mineral called wollastonite down, which is better for scientific reasons, but much less abundant and much more expensive than limestone. So we learned that actually limestone is being spread in a lot of tropical countries, and especially in Brazil, where so the soils tend to be acidic in the tropics because of the heavy rainfall. And so that influenced our decision to go with limestone, even though the IPCC had said at one point that limestone isn't a good choice for rock weathering. That's actually been challenged recently. And I think the evidence really points to it being both effective and relatively inexpensive and widely deployed around the world. So it seems like a more equitable starting point for developing this possible solution.
Thank you, Beth, for this really important question. I think as a historian, the way I think about solutions and problems is sometimes to kind of move beyond this kind of binary, partly because at least just writing and studying the war-khasi ecologies in the India-Bangladesh borderlands, I think there are historical regenerative practices already there, and there are people who have been practicing these. The problem is the post-colonial state doesn't recognize many of these grassroots grounded solutions and has not done enough to empower these solutions on the ground, right? So as a historian, I think part of my commitment is to how do I write histories that builds a precedent for this world that is currently marginalized, right? So that's where the archives come in. That's where some of the participatory research comes in, and that's where I think about the possibilities of academic work, right? Pushing the boundaries of academic work. What would allyship look like a kind of alliance that doesn't simply go through the conventional route of the intergovernmental treaty organization. Like, for example, for me, it would be like a professor at Brown, as an Ivy League professor, it would be very easy for me to kind of draw on some of these UNESCO networks, but it's a conscious choice that I do not want to go through that because I'm curious about understanding these kind of grassroots histories and grassroots conservation work that's already happening, and I'm curious about understanding these voices and how do they shift the narrative. And this is a borderland, the borderland, it's a borderland, which means that identities are policed. The post-colonial state has exceptional power. So talking about conservation work, trying to center some of these grassroots conservation work also requires an acute awareness about the political liabilities that may exist for some of my interlocutors. So I'm very conscious about not kind of positing some of these grassroots conservation work as oppositional to state. And I don't think they're oppositional to state. They are actually much more. They draw from a deeper environmental stewardship that predates the post-colonial state and also British Empire. So that is a deeper environmental history of solutions there already. Okay.
All right. Do we have a question from online?
Yes. This question is from Betsy Stubblefield-Lux. The focus of this day is on seeding collaborative action. What kinds of collaborations are the panelists looking for, and what would make it easier to establish those partnerships?
I'll start. I'll try to be very brief. So, and I also want to just quickly say one thing in response to the previous question, to Beth's question. I think just on a high level, something that's really important is that we do focus or try to focus on solutions and not shy away from them. I think that often scholars are cautious about prescribing solutions because we worry about unintended consequences or the unknown, various things, the uncertainty behind our data, et cetera, et cetera. But thinking about solutions, I think, is I think really critical, and that in turn implies sort of a level of hope and optimism that we could identify things that we could do that might actually make a difference. And I think it's easy to sort of dwell in despair, for lack of a better term, and that is not helpful. And so I think that thinking about solutions, which implies being hopeful, is critical as sort of like a meta level answer to your question. And then to the online question, to pivot to that, so I'm in the process of pivoting some of the findings that I have just shared with, or that I briefly shared with you, into a next phase of this research where I will bring those findings back to practicing attorneys in such organizations and ask them to explain them to me, essentially. And I hope that is one way that I can actually not just collect data as a social scientist, but build partnerships. And so I think that thinking creatively about how we can bring our data forward into the world and then use that interaction to actually generate more understanding and relationships is sort of one piece of the puzzle that the question asker is getting at least that I think about. So,
I guess maybe I have something to offer here too. I have never had any trouble. One of the pleasures of being here at Brown is that I actually have never had any trouble finding collaborators. People are easy to find. They are approachable. I harass them. They answer my questions. Sometimes that's all and I go away, and sometimes it turns into long-term collaborations. I have people now that I work with at the hospital in molecular biology, in evolutionary biology, in math. I mean, that really has been one of the pleasures of being around here, and I guess that I would just encourage anybody else to do the same thing. Harassment is easy because everybody's email is easy to find.
So
I have a question, actually. Since this is our environment, this panel of broadly among the 4 panels. So one of the real tensions and one of the reasons why ECF is distinct from IBIS is that ECF is focused on climate, which is a global problem. And in the typical environmental thinking, we're told to think globally, act locally. But both Brad and Chris mentioned times when the local action, if scaled up to the global scale, would actually be counterproductive to the climate problem. And so there's a really key question of like who the community is that manages those 2 perspectives at the same time in order to find an equitable solution on a local basis to a global problem. So hope you would have some comments about that.
Thank you. I think that's, again, a really important and a relevant question, especially for the East Khasi Hills district of Meghalaya in Northeast India, partly because the ecologies where the living root bridges are located. I mean, from the photograph, you may see that, oh, these are lush, beautiful green ecologies. But actually, there is another picture to it, right? These are also sites of massive limestone and coal mining that has destabilized hills, that has intensified landslides in the monsoons because it receives some of the most intensive monsoon rainfall on Earth. Now, climate change is a very it's a very loaded phrase in this region, partly because the Meghalaya government, for instance, would say that, oh, the monsoons are very, very unpredictable and very intensive in this region because of the planetary global warming. There is nothing that this regional government can do, right? But if a lot of these kind of studies actually say that, well, the way global warming and climate change is actually experienced has a lot to do with the regional drivers of climate change, right? How the regional drivers of climate change, whether this is mining, extractive activities, deforestation, plantation, industrial plantation, how all of that actually intensify the planetary problem. So I think there is a way in which the nuance is taken away from the climate change, especially by the government rhetoric, and how we need to understand grassroots local action because it tries to ground some of that, right? Thank you.
Just quickly, I would also, it's a very important, very hard question. But when I think about it, where my mind goes is towards sort of building in reflexivity or just awareness of the feedback loops between outcomes and next stage processes, right? So I don't think that we can count on sort of grassroots efforts solving the problem for the reasons that you articulate. There's also not a lot of reason to think that just top-down efforts are going to work. What matters is sort of the dialogue between those things and creating, I think, or hopefully even institutionalizing opportunities for people pushing from the bottom up to think about what's wrong with the top-down approach and vice versa. And that sort of interaction between those two things or being aware of that is what might help us move in positive directions. I think all interventions are going to be imperfect and problematic. The question is what we do with the information about their problems. So I think creating awareness of those is the sort of spirit of what I'm talking about. But I certainly don't know how to do that at scale. I just think it's something to be aware of.
Yeah, I think this question is closely related to the question of whether one should focus on your personal carbon footprint versus making social action to change large corporations and so on. I feel this is somewhat of a false dichotomy. I've actually made my home carbon negative, and by putting on lots of solar panels and heat pumps and electric car and turning off gas and so on, I'm under no illusion that this is anything but the tiniest drop in the bucket for the globe. But it feels empowering to me to be able to do that. I can afford to do that. Most people can't afford to do that, but personally, just taking these actions just psychologically makes me feel less a victim of circumstances, so that I can maybe get more energy to deal with the larger social issues.
One quick thought too is that I think a lot of people don't think that clearly about what it means to scale up. You know, like who's actually going to do the scaling, especially on something like climate change, where it's a worldwide problem. And when I think about what are the easiest ways to scale up, what I think about might be the most effective is coming up with compelling models of action at a small scale that can be copied. You know, it can be stolen. Like that seems to me to be the most likely route to having a solution go to scale. So, for example, you know, coming up with something that actually makes economic sense for a farmer to do, that also helps reduce the albedo or increase the albedo, I guess. Whichever. Push it in the right direction. I mean, that seems like a more likely route to scaling up to the kinds of to the sizes that we actually need than a government program.
All right, and we are at time. I want to thank you all for your participation and your good questions. Thanks very much to our panelists for a very interesting sharing.